Let me give you a little history of myself just to fill you in. I was raised in the Midwest as a good Christian, a Methodist in this case. In college, I came to realize that there is no reliable evidence for a God. And later on, I've discovered that there's no reliable evidence that Jesus ever existed. A lot of people find this very hard to understand because many of you have been raised all along teaching that Jesus did in fact exist, that he actually walked the earth, and having been taught that God really does exist. Humans are storytelling animals. We love to tell stories. We love to listen to stories. When you go to a movie, you like a good movie because it's a good story. We tell stories when we sleep. Our brains create stories to tell us what happened in the day before. I maintain that Jesus and God are just stories that we've created to help us understand what goes on in a largely chaotic universe. Over the years, there have been thousands of gods and thousands of religions created by human beings in their attempts to explain the universe around us. Now, first of all, we need to define which God we're talking about. As I mentioned, that there have been thousands of gods that have been worshipped and still are worshipped here on our planet. So, as we pointed out, we're going to be talking about Yahweh, what is now called the Christian God. Some people think of him as the Judeo-Christian God because he's largely defined in the Old Testament and followed through in what we call the New Testament. So first of all, let's take a look at this description of Yahweh. As was pointed out, Yahweh is typically defined as omnipotent, which means he can do anything. I'm going to use the male pronoun for him, even though a lot of people like to think of him as non-gender specific. So first of all, he's omnipotent, which means he can do anything, quite literally. He's omniscient, which means he knows everything. And he's omnibenevolent, which means he's all-loving. This sounds really good. I mean, it sounds like a really great guy. But unfortunately, all these characteristics can't exist logically in any one single being. If God were omniscient, he would know what's going to happen tomorrow, and thus can't change it, which then throws out omnipotence. For instance, if God knows what the lottery numbers are going to be tomorrow, God could write them down. Now God can't change that. Omnibenevolent, all-loving, sounds really good, but as we all know, terrible things do indeed happen to everybody on this planet, especially at certain times when evil things really do happen. So I've shown that Yahweh, the definition of Yahweh, is inconsistent and completely illogical. The common definition is a square circle. We can't have a square circle. We can't have something that is both square and a circle. Thus, Yahweh is like that and can't exist. One of the big uses for a God is to explain the universe around us. This is what God has been done ever since gods have been defined. With the advent of science, starting to a great degree with the ancient Greeks, and then followed through and added into our civilization by Galileo, we've come up with a method for understanding how the universe works around us, so we don't need to resort to gods to explain things. It used to be that gods caused everything. Gods caused the sun to apparently go around the earth, to come up and go down. God called the weather. God's called diseases. God's called caused good and bad things. We don't need gods now because we understand to a great degree what's really going on. I maintain that there's no empirical, which means reliable and tested evidence for any God. There's no explicit evidence for a God. I can think of many examples of things I would expect a God to be able to do, but I see no evidence for it. I see a lot of people wishing and hoping that there's a God, but none of this is occurring. The Bible, the supposed Word of God, is full of absurd moral failings. People being slaughtered for obviously what I view as just political or power reasons. Even Jesus, in one point, talks about how a slave owner could cut a slave apart, could chop him into little tiny pieces if the slave owner were upset with his slave. I don't view this as any sort of moral basis. I think I'm not a Bible expert, but I do read other Bible experts. I think that Jesus was most likely a fictional character created originally by Paul and then filled in much later by whoever wrote the Gospels. If you read Paul, the lack of knowledge in Paul is astounding. First of all, he never claimed that he met Jesus. His only point was that he had some vision on the road to Damascus, as it's known. To me, this sounds rather like he had an epileptic fit or something like that. We now know that such brain seizures, can create very strong religious feelings. That doesn't mean that they're true, but they're very strong religious feelings. So Jesus first shows up in the writings of Paul around 50. Later on, now first of all, this is, 17 years after the supposed existence of Jesus. Paul fully admits that he never met Jesus. He talks about having met other people, but he never actually met Jesus. Jesus, okay, let's take a look at Paul. Paul knows nothing about Jesus' life. Paul knows nothing about where Jesus was born, where Jesus visited, where Jesus died, any of that stuff. So to Paul, Jesus is really more of a sky god. And that's how Paul originally saw him. Paul, we think, wrote of Jesus as largely fulfilling Jewish prophecy, but largely in the sky. So about 20 years after Paul wrote, people started writing what we now call the Gospels. First, let's take a look at them. They were written now at about 70 AD at the earliest, which means it's almost 40 years after the supposed life of Jesus. Who knows, how many of you can actually remember what somebody said yesterday, or a week ago, or a month ago? And yet we supposedly have these Gospels written 40 years after the fact. Next, we have no idea who the authors were. They're largely attributed to the four main authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we don't know who they were. So they're unknown texts written by unknown people of the time. To me, it really sounds like they created... Jesus is a great character. But they created this character largely out of whole cloth, out of just ideas, filling in the original story that Paul had come up with this way. Whoever wrote Mark also didn't really know the area. There's a couple of points where we know that. At one point, he talks about a woman divorcing her husband, how that should not be done. Well, any person who was alive at the time would know that this is absolutely absurd, because women had no power at the time. Whoever wrote Mark also gets a little confused about where certain cities existed. He has Jesus going from A to B to C when Jesus could have walked directly across. He wasn't really familiar with the area at the time. The other two, Matthew and Luke, largely copy from Mark. Why would somebody who was an eyewitness copy from somebody else? They'd sit down, well, ladies and gentlemen, here's what I saw. Here is my evidence. But there's none of that. There's just copying. It becomes readily apparent when you start analyzing it that whoever wrote Matthew and Luke was largely copying from the story of Mark. The Gospel of John that we talk about is quite similar to Paul, where John views Jesus as largely a sky god with little earthly existence. Jesus fulfilled a lot of prophecy in his life, as everybody who was raised a Christian know. How was this done so easily? It's fairly obvious from several events written into the Bible that this was done merely to fulfill prophecy. It's easy to do this if you're simply creating a fictional character. How do we know this? There's a couple of times where it becomes quite obvious. When I was raised, the Palm Sunday was a big deal. Little kid, you get to hold palm tree branches out, and it's all a big deal. But if you actually analyze it in the Bible, it is rather strange. Jesus has his followers going into town and coming back with two animals, and then Jesus rides them both into town. You can't bareback ride two animals, or in this case, they put some clothes over them. The reason for this is whoever is writing the gospel is looking through the Old Testament, attempting to find events, prophecy that he could fill in the story of Jesus. So at one point in the Old Testament, it has the king of Zion riding a donkey on a colt, the foal of a donkey. It's rather strange language, but in that style, they only meant really one animal. But whoever's writing the gospel is reading through this and doesn't really understand this particular style of writing. So he has, it says that Jesus shall ride two animals, so I'll just write it into two animals. That's an impossibility. It cannot be done. So we can see from that one point that whoever's writing this at this point was trying to fulfill prophecy by writing it into the story of Jesus, by writing an impossible event into the story of Jesus.